Welcome to our series. Our team is grateful you're here. Of course, seeing you in person would be preferable, but given the ongoing response to managing the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic here at Hopkins and also in our local communities, these virtual platforms have proven to be an efficient means for sharing information, for education and discussion. A couple of updates. This is our first session of the fall semester. Please keep connected. You can find our updated programming in our newsletter on the web. Just Google Greenberg Bladder Cancer Institute. And I wanted to draw your attention again to our group of educational supportive care programs, specifically tailored around the experiences of women with bladder cancer, developed and led by Drs. Armin Smith and Jeannie Hoffman-Sensis, and the program team of Pamela Getz, Samantha Rockler, and Stephanie Cooper Greenberg. Again, all of these are up on our website, and if we can help you directly, we are only an email away at bladdercancer@jhmi.edu. Grateful to all of you for joining us today for a conversation with our Deputy Director, Dr. Noah Hahn. If you will allow me a deeper introduction, Noah is a medical oncologist who cares for patients with bladder cancer. He earned his MD from Indiana University School of Medicine, and then he completed his residency in internal medicine at Duke University School of Medicine, before performing a fellowship in medical oncology at Indiana University School of Medicine. He joined the Johns Hopkins faculty in 2014. Prior to that, he was the director of genitourinary medical oncology at Indiana University and the chief scientific officer for the Hoosier Oncology Group, a cancer research organization that evaluates innovative and promising approaches to cancer treatment. He is currently conducting clinical trials to test new therapies for bladder cancer, including those for early stage bladder cancer. He's a member of the Bladder Cancer Task Force for the National Cancer Institute's GU Cancer Steering Committee and is chair for the Bladder Cancer Subcommittee of the Eastern Cooperative Oncology Group. Today, we are changing it up yet again. By popular demand, I'm grateful that Noah has extended himself to offer office hours with Dr. Hahn, walk-ins welcome. Dr. Hahn will provide a summary of progress made over the past year in research and clinical care of patients with urothelial cancer. And then following his summary, he will field questions on all topics urothelial cancer related from participants in an open mic style format. I would ask for attendees to bring questions into the chat, and then Talon and I will coordinate them and pose them directly to Noah on your behalf. Please welcome Dr. Noah Hahn.
All right, thanks, David, for that great introduction, and it's a pleasure to be back again to this forum. As David mentioned, we try to rotate the content a little bit with each session, but I always enjoy reaching out to the broader community, both through this virtual session and hopefully, I can't put words into David's mouth or the Hopkins infection control people, but hopefully we'll be able to do some events maybe in person in the not too distant future. But with that being said, as David commented, we're going to do this session a little bit differently, and for better or worse, you're stuck with me unplugged for the whole hour. We've actually talked about this within the GBCI a little bit about some future content separate from the grand round sessions about ways to reach out to our patients, families, other researchers, et cetera, the bladder and upper tract community in a little bit more informal back and forth dialogue sort of session. And that's sort of where the title of kind of open office hours, walk-ins welcome it comes from. We'd like your feedback both on this session, but then also on the idea of maybe having some type of recurring sort of program content that is an interactive sort of scenario, whether that is, a chat room, whether it's, a group sort of video call kind of thing, where literally you can pose questions, to myself and other team members who choose to participate, where we can be a sounding board for you. Nothing official, doesn't replace sort of, an official sort of consult in clinic for folks with actual health concerns. But we want to be a conduit to be able to interpret some of the information in a rapidly and ever-changing sort of complicated landscape of both the clinical care and new and emerging sort of breakthroughs in the field. So your feedback is definitely welcome, both throughout this session and afterwards. As far as what I just wanted to cover, again, there'll be no slides. I just like to kind of talk a little bit about some perspectives in the last year, as I kind of see them in terms of some of the updates in the field and things that I think are promising and that I'm excited about, both things that we're doing here at the GBCI, but also in the bladder cancer community at large. So I'm going to structure just my discussion part, just kind of based on disease states, kind of going from early non-muscle invasive bladder cancer to muscle invasive and then to metastatic urothelial cancer. And I'll kind of just touch on a little bit of some potpourri topics that I kind of scratched down in the last day or two that I think are noteworthy. Some of them you may know about, but some not. If you do, it's always good to hear about them again. But again, this will not take 30 minutes for me to cover. So the bulk of this session is meant to be interactive. So I'll start with non-muscle invasive bladder cancer first. And I think in the last year, one of the things that I'm most excited about is that there have been a couple of trials report out that are looking at combination sort of strategies, combination therapies to try to treat non-muscle invasive bladder cancer. And so, for context purposes, for non-muscle invasive bladder cancer, particularly high-grade bladder cancer, so this is carcinoma in situ or high-grade TA or T1 disease, intravesical BCG treatment has been the mainstay of treatment up front. And it still is. We've talked on this forum about the BCG shortage. That's an ongoing challenge. But we have not seen the way that we have seen in metastatic urothelial cancer and many metastatic cancers outside of the urothelial population. We've not seen establishment of improvements in non-muscle invasive bladder cancer with combination approaches. So something added to BCG or different types of treatment, whether it's BCG or not, combination chemotherapy, immunotherapy, those kinds of things. And then last year, we started to see some data come out from a couple of different trials that is not practice changing yet, but I think it gives us a flavor of sort of what is possible when we combine more than one therapy in non-muscle invasive bladder cancer. So the first one that I'll mention is a trial that has been completed, has been presented in the last year, that is a phase 3 trial being done with the intent to maybe get it registered by the FDA. This is a trial of a drug that was originally called N803 that is combined with BCG for patients in the trial that were BCG unresponsive. It wouldn't necessarily make sense to be intuitive to kind of give more BCG to BCG unresponsive patients. We've talked a long time about how once they've met that criteria to be called BCG unresponsive, that they shouldn't get further BCG. Well, a couple of trials have sort of challenged that and said, well, maybe BCG still has a role in sort of creating inflammation in the sort of the tumor environment that could be beneficial, but maybe there are other factors that make the response to BCG resistant. And the N803 plus BCG trial was one of them. So N803 is an intravesical administered agent. And in simple terms, it targets a modulator of the inflammatory response called IL or interleukin 15. And interleukin 15 is interesting because it seems to stimulate a particular subset of immune cells that are called natural killer cells. Natural killer cells work in concert with T cells, but they can kill cancer cells by themselves, independent of T cells. And so this trial of N803 plus BCG demonstrated a complete response rate of 72%. And at 1 year after therapy, a little over 40% of the patients were still maintaining a complete response. Now, that means 60% did not maintain it, but to put that into perspective, the only drug that has been approved in the BCG unresponsive population in the last 5 years has been pembrolizumab or Keytruda. And in that trial with Keytruda alone, about 40% of patients achieved a complete response, and only just short of 20% maintained it at 1 year. So this trial of N803 plus BCG, and just on raw numbers, seems to have about doubled that. Now, there's some issues with it, trying to figure out, how many patients would respond to BCG again, even in an unresponsive setting. What's the contribution of the N803 on top of BCG? These are all issues I think that the FDA will need to sort out as they kind of review, this trial. But I think it sort of challenges the notion of sort of what the threshold should be for success in the BCG unresponsive setting. In other words, it's sort of a shot across the bow to say, wait a sec, we actually, when we combine maybe more than one therapy that work differently, that are complementary, maybe we can actually push the complete response rate, north of 50%, and maybe even the sustained complete response at 1 year, approaching 40 to 50%. So I think that's pretty encouraging. We haven't seen that before. And I think in a similar sort of tone, 2 other studies in the last year have sort of shown similar results. So a different trial looked at, again, in BCG unresponsive patients, combining further BCG therapy with the immune checkpoint inhibitor atezolizumab. So the atezolizumab is an intravenous therapy. It targets, as we've talked about in this forum several times, an immune target that's important called PD-L1. Well, in their smaller trial, they saw complete response rates of 58%. Again, much higher than what we had seen with the first sort of round of BCG unresponsive trials where we're targeting 30, 40%. Small study, we still need to kind of see more. But even our own group in the ADAPT Bladder trial that I've had the fortune of leading for the last couple of years, we looked at a different combination of the immune checkpoint inhibitor durvalumab, which also targets PD-L1. And when we combined it with BCG, we saw a complete response rate of 85%. And at 1 year, 72% of those patients were still in a complete response. So again, our study and the atezolizumab study were smaller studies. They were phase 1, only about 12 to 15 patients in those arms. But I think that's 3 studies now in the last year that have come out with pretty high complete response rates when we've had at least combination therapies with 2 agents that work differently. Now, in all 3 of these cases, these were 2 immunotherapy agents combined. 2 of them had systemic agents combined with BCG, 1 an intravesical agent combined with BCG. But I think it shows us that when we combine therapies that we may be able to push the bar on sort of the response. Now, the question that these and other studies will need to answer is at what cost? Will we see side effects, toxicity, that may or may not be worth it, in the eyes of the patients and the physicians. So we're going to need to see how that happens. And then lastly, as far as the combination therapy approach goes, I'll just mention combination chemotherapy in the bladder, intravesical chemotherapy, because our group led by Max Cates and others have had significant experience with the chemotherapy combination gemcitabine and docetaxel. It is probably the most commonly used treatment for patients who are BCG unresponsive, who do not want to go on to cystectomy, who are not eligible maybe for some of these clinical trials, based on retrospective data published in the last 2 to 3 years. But Max Cates is actually leading a trial of the gem-doce combination in high-risk BCG naive patients here at Hopkins. He also will then test it in a large phase 3 trial versus BCG head-to-head across the country. in a phase 3 trial that will be opening before the end of the year. And then we also have some experience with the gemdosi combination combined with the immunotherapy agent durvalumab that I talked about just previously with BCG. All of these are still early, but what I can tell you is we're pretty encouraged by the results that we've seen so far. It's probably going to take us maybe about a year to kind of finish out the full 1-year follow-up to know about the durability question. But I think this is exciting for non-muscle invasive bladder cancer patients because I think it's shown that you know, when we are rationally maybe a little more aggressive with combination therapy, we may be able to achieve complete responses in more patients. And our hope is that these may translate into durable responses where patients can keep their bladder and maintain a high quality of life. Switching gears a little bit, and still in the non-muscle invasive setting, separate from therapies, the other thing in the last year that I think I'm pretty excited about is that there are some diagnostic platforms looking at tumor DNA in the urine that look very promising for our ability to profile a patient's tumor genetic mutations in the urine in a non-invasive way that seems to be pretty concordant with the tumor biopsy tissues that have been done in some early studies. The reason I think that this is important, it's not that we couldn't, you know, do a TURBT or biopsy, profile a tumor, get the genetic mutations, and then sort of think about, you know, clinical trials or therapies that might be optimal to those patients. It's just that the workflow for doing that, getting biopsy, sending tissue, genetic testing taking 2 to 3 weeks, patients waiting, still waiting for maybe their definitive BCG or whether they're going to go on to TURBT. It's a tough workflow to you know, ask patients and physicians to go through. Some of these platforms now in the urine, though, are tests that can be done, at least collected, you know, at the time of the office-based cystoscopy where maybe a recurrent tumor is noted. You know, the urine can be collected right then and sent off, and the results back, you know, within 7 to 10 days, a much shorter turnaround time. These are early and I think are just now being incorporated into trials that are being done now. But I think in my mind with, you know, with FGFR3 already identified as an important mutation to profile in metastatic patients because of the approval of erdafitinib, which targets it, this has me excited for non-muscle invasive bladder cancer patients and the true prospect of bringing precision medicine into the non-muscle invasive population. We've talked about it for a long time, especially with FGFR3, because those mutations are very frequent in low-grade bladder cancer at the non-muscle invasive stage, but it's been difficult for us to logistically implement. And I think some of these urine-based tumor DNA platforms are pretty exciting. I think we're going to see more of that in the next couple of years. But this is actually, I think, the first venture of some platforms that I think are feasible and something that can be executed in the clinic. So moving a little bit further along to muscle invasive bladder cancer and also sort of sticking with this tumor DNA theme. I think the thing I'm most excited about in the last year has been the launch of a couple of prospective phase 3 clinical trials that are really going to test this idea about circulating tumor DNA detection after surgery and whether or not, you know, to intensify adjuvant therapy with immunotherapy. So nivolumab, a PD-1 inhibitor, is FDA approved now for high-risk post-cystectomy, post-nephroureterectomy, urothelial cancer patients who have high-risk disease after surgery. Right now, it's applied to everybody, but some of the ctDNA data that's come out in the last 2 to 3 years would suggest that patients who are ctDNA negative following surgery have an excellent outcome, and that those who are ctDNA positive do not. And so that those with ctDNA positive, it would follow are probably the ones most likely in need, of additional therapy. Well, there are several trials now that are launching that are going to ask that specifically. So they will measure ctDNA in everybody following surgery. And those who are ctDNA positive will then go on to trials that are looking at treating with immunotherapy, either singular or in combinations. And we'll look at that prospectively. They also will follow the ctDNA negative patients to confirm that they do well. But this is going to tell us where to go with this. And it's not just at the time after surgery, a yes/no question. These trials are going to continue to check the ctDNA at various intervals, typically about every 3 months, for the duration that the patients are on these trials, so that we'll also understand the role of ctDNA in the monitoring aspect of their cancer journey. So you can think about it, if someone is ctDNA positive when they start treatment after surgery and their ctDNA goes to undetectable, we would think that would be very good. We kind of want to know what happens to those patients who it later becomes detectable again. Do we need to jump on that right there and change therapy? Or is that really just going to predate their CT scan by 2-3 months, but not change their outcomes? These are things that we really need to know, because we need to know how to counsel the patients. These tests are now available commercially. People can get them, but it makes it tough for us to give definitive recommendations. So I'm pretty excited about these trials because I think this is an incredibly important question for all of us to answer. And I think we will be able to. I think these trials have been designed the right way. Now, lastly, as far as, I guess, the didactic part of my rambling here, I'll talk about metastatic urothelial cancer and a couple of recent conferences and some results of some trials that have been anticipated were presented. We still haven't seen them published in manuscript form, but I think a lot of the bladder cancer community has been talking about this quite a bit. So we've talked on this forum before about the new class of medications in the last 2 to 3 years called antibody drug conjugates, and how there are 2 antibody drug conjugates now approved by the FDA in the United States for metastatic urothelial cancer patients. One is called enfortumab vedotin, or EV, and the other is called sacituzumab govitecan, or SG. They hit different targets and have different sort of chemotherapy backbones to them. But the enfortumab antibody drug conjugate has been part of an ongoing study that was called the EV-103 study. It's sort of the study that keeps on going and keeps on giving. The original study started, I think, 6 years ago, and it has gone through several amendments where they have continued to add additional cohorts to study different populations in the metastatic setting, in neoadjuvant around perioperative treatments for muscle invasive disease. But the results that have come out in the last 3 to 4 months come from one of those cohorts that is called Cohort K. We're actually up to letter K on this. I can tell you how many amendments it's gone through. But Cohort K was essentially a randomized phase 2 trial. This was metastatic urothelial cancer patients, frontline setting, had not been treated with anything yet for their metastatic disease. They were cisplatin ineligible, and they were randomized 1-to-1 to receive enfortumab vedotin plus pembrolizumab, the immunotherapy targeting PD-1, or enfortumab vedotin alone. So it's really asking the question about whether combining enfortumab with pembrolizumab adds clinical benefit. And there were about 150 patients in the Cohort K, so 75 roughly on each arm. What the trial showed is that the addition of pembrolizumab to the enfortumab did definitely and significantly increase the response rates compared to enfortumab alone. 65% of patients had a confirmed response with the combination versus 45% with EV by itself. And that was a statistically significant result per the way the trial was designed. So it was a positive trial. The other thing that it showed, and again, we just got the first pass, of the results that were presented in September at the ESMO conference in Paris. We don't have the overall survival for the whole group because these patients were doing very well, which is a good thing. As far as landmarks go, if you look at 1 year, 81% of patients who got the combination were alive versus 71% with the enfortumab alone. So it suggests that the combination may actually improve how long patients are living compared to sort of the enfortumab alone, and then maybe a sequential approach where maybe you would treat them with pembrolizumab sort of at progression or something like that. So this, the other thing I'll add for this, which I think is impressive visually when you see this, is that 97% of the patients that were treated with the combination had at least some shrinkage of their measurable disease. So it may not have met the 30% reduction required to count as a RECIST or partial response in clinical trials, but 97% had some reduction. So very, very few patients that were just blasting through therapy and progressing on combination. So I think a lot of people in the United States are very excited about this. It's not FDA approved yet. I think many of us anticipate that the makers of enfortumab and pembrolizumab will present these results to the FDA for consideration of approval in the United States. There is a larger confirmatory global phase 3 trial being done that is looking at the combination of enfortumab plus compared to standard chemotherapy in the first-line setting for metastatic urothelial cancer patients. That trial is called EV302. It's fully accrued, and I think we expect probably to see the initial results. You never know, but I think most of us are expecting maybe in the next 12 to 15 months that we should see that presented at a conference somewhere. That will be the definitive answer, but in the meantime, it would not surprise me if these initial results are presented to the FDA, and it's quite possible it might get approved in the United States. And if it does, then I think that's, I think it's a good thing for our patients no matter what, because whether or not the confirmatory trial demonstrates that it beats head-to-head chemo, it's clear that the combination of enfortumab and pembrolizumab is definitely an active combination. So I think it presents safety data. It presents a combination for us as a field to figure out who needs the combination, when best to use it, and where. So we're going to learn a lot more about this. This combination is being studied in other settings too, around muscle invasive bladder cancer before and after surgery. So we will be seeing this for the next few years to learn how to better tailor it. I think the implications, though, of this is that if enfortumab plus pembrolizumab, if it is confirmed to beat chemotherapy, and that is a big if, in their large phase 3 trial, it changes or could potentially change the landscape of the way we think about treating patients in that metastatic setting. We've talked for decades about whether a patient is cisplatin eligible or ineligible, and whether we should give cisplatin-based chemotherapy or carboplatin-based chemotherapy. Enfortumab and pembrolizumab sort of crosses those lines where we can give that to patients with decreased kidney function. So cisplatin eligible is not so much of an issue with this combination. There are other things that come into play. So anybody with autoimmune diseases, that's problematic for us when we use immunotherapy. Certain patients with enfortumab, if they already have bad neuropathy from diabetes or other conditions, that can be tricky. But it's exciting. And I think what's exciting is not just that particular sort of combination, but I think the fact that we're seeing higher response rates in metastatic patients and higher survival rates at 1 year, 2 years with these combinations than what we've seen ever before. That makes it somewhat difficult sometimes to beat, but that's a really good thing. when our patients are doing so well that it makes it difficult for us to figure out how to design a trial to beat the current standard of care, that's a good problem to have. And I think we're starting to get there in urothelial cancer. We still have a lot of ways to go. But these are just a few things across the board, like I said, in all stages of disease, I think in the last year that I think are pretty exciting. So I'm going to stop there, and there's a couple things in the Q&A which I can see, and I can kind of go through these probably one by one. I'm not sure what the answer live button is here, but I'm going to take the first question, which comes from Daryl. Are there combo trials coming for those of us that have carcinoma in situ non-muscle invasive bladder cancer that tried Keytruda and did not respond, such as CG0070 monotherapy versus CG007 plus Keytruda has a higher complete response rate? The short answer is yes. So one of the issues which we've not had until recently is enough patients, as you mentioned, that have gotten sort of the systemic immune therapies, Keytruda, and then are in need of additional therapies. So many of the trials that were designed for CIS patients that were registration intent, they would exclude patients who had prior immune checkpoint therapy. I know of a couple of trials that are coming out, one that is under current active investigation. So I talked about the enfortumab vedotin pembrolizumab combination in the metastatic setting. Enfortumab vedotin as a single agent is being investigated in BCG unresponsive non-muscle invasive bladder cancer patients with CIS, and it does allow prior Keytruda or other immune checkpoint inhibitor therapies because it is looking at trying to establish the right sort of dose and schedule of using EV given intravesically. So this is not IV. So that is one trial that allows it. There are other studies though that if they're not using an immune checkpoint inhibitor, that are starting to understand that, hey, we need to allow those patients in. So there'll be more, but there are some out there. And if there are any specific ones that you're interested in, I'm happy to kind of take that offline and kind of look at them a little bit closer. David, I think, did you have a comment on that? I think I saw your hand raised.
No hand raised.
Okay.
Yep.
Second question I'll take from Karen. It says, at T2 muscle invasive, what is the optimum time frame for choosing and implementing treatment, gathering info, options, et cetera, within 3 to 4 months, or not? Well, I think there's a couple things that go into that. So if we look at historical data and published literature that looked only at the timing of surgery from the diagnosis of muscle invasive bladder cancer, it's kind of been widely held that the 3-month or kind of 12-week mark really seems to be a cut point where if patients get cystectomy, meaning their surgery at that point, that they have better outcomes than those who had delayed surgery after 12 weeks for whatever reason, whether that's patient choice, whether it's complications, whether it's other things that happen. So that's kind of been widely held. 12 weeks seems like a cut point. But what we don't know is, we don't know as clearly is if patients are being actively treated with treatments that have proven activity. So let's say, for instance, chemotherapy. We don't know how far we can push that. I think most people, physicians, I should say, get nervous when we get out past 3 months. Past 3 months, I think most physicians would want to sort of kind of reset the score and almost restage them, even look in the bladder, get the CT scans, make sure everything is still muscle invasive, has not metastasized. The question though about do you have time to get other options and other opinions, I think the short answer is yes. But I think from the patient side, one thing I think I would would need to sort of clarify and emphasize is that it's really important to be your own advocate because of the way workflows happen and referral patterns. 3 months sounds like a long time, but it's not as much as you think. If the TURBT is done and you kind of don't get kind of regular follow-up until kind of 2 weeks, because pathology takes a week, and we want to make sure we've got it resolved before we then have the phone call or the in-office visit. You're informed of the muscle invasive bladder cancer, given an option of surgery, radiation, chemo, referral locally. Those referrals, a lot of times take 2 weeks to 3 weeks to kind of, get into those separate offices to discuss the plan. And then talking about clinical trials, or if you want to go seek other opinions, you can burn up the 3 months pretty quick. I think it's always great to get other opinions though. So in my own patients, like if I see them for the first time, I definitely encourage them to get other opinions. I just encourage them to try to be very active about that. Make the phone calls, make the follow-ups, and really call those offices 2 days later if you've not heard from them. Don't sit back and wait for kind of email sort of trails to come and find you, because I think you can lose time in that setting. Next question's from Karen. Is ctDNA on a surveillance trial or incorporated into other combination trials? I would say sort of both. So most of the ctDNA companies that are developing these platforms, most of them are trying to incorporate the monitoring and surveillance into the context of a therapeutic clinical trial. There have been a few companies that have done just ctDNA monitoring, period, sort of in patients treated with standard of care. So I mentioned the urine ctDNA. There have been a few companies that have worked with that in the monitoring of patients sort of around sort of the initial diagnosis of non-muscle invasive bladder cancer with or without BCG treatment longitudinally. There have also been companies that have done this around the time of surgery for muscle invasive disease of the bladder or the upper tract. And I think most of those experiences have shown a lot of us, I think, that we're going to need to probably collect the ctDNA in our future clinical trials in order to really understand how to risk stratify patients with no measurable disease. So for instance, let's just say they were metastatic to start with, and they had a great response to whatever therapy they're being on in a trial, and there's no evidence of disease on CT scans left. Is that patient that is CAT scan complete response, but ctDNA positive, are they the same as a patient who is CAT scan negative, but ctDNA negative? My gut would tell me is they're probably different, but I think the trials that are ongoing will answer that for sure. We have been fooled before, sometimes by some early biomarkers that may or may not have been sort of enough to tell us we should switch therapy based on them alone. But I think both are happening, both monitoring and in clinical trials. And then I think the last question I had in the chat room, and definitely more, field more, we've got time, is from Andronette. What about patients with kidney problems? And this is actually a really good question. My great colleague here at the GBCI, Jeannie Hoffman-Sensis, who's been on this forum before, has talked about this. Not only upper tract patients, but even patients with bladder cancer with poor kidney function, that there's a need for patients with renal insufficiency. She's leading one of, I'd say one of the most innovative trials, specifically in upper tract disease, that is looking at patients with upper tract disease who are facing potentially a a surgical option that would require them to go on dialysis because of loss of the kidney of an upper tract tumor. You know, as you can imagine, that is not a prospect that any patient, you know, wants to tackle. We have patients who do, because if their disease is confined to the upper tract, is not metastasized, they may be cured, you know, by that procedure, but at the cost of going on dialysis. So she's leading a trial actually of enfortumab vedotin and pembrolizumab. That is what we call it, we use the term renal retention study, that is specifically looking at patients with decreased kidney function, not only to learn about the safety of the drug, but also the effectiveness, and really to understand, you know, can we benefit patients both in terms of good cancer control, but also keep their kidney. And I think this trial that she's leading is going to be very important, because one of the things that's a gap for us in some of these larger trials is patients who don't fit the eligibility criteria often are not included in the trial. And we still need to understand, is the exact result of the trial, can we replicate it? Are there different concerns in patients with decreased kidney function? So that's just one example. We're not the only center, you know, that's doing that, but we'd like to see more. We'd like to see, you know, and myself and others at other institutions have been working with the FDA in the last year to try to give them feedback from the bladder community about, you know, some of the requirements for FDA registration trials. It would be nice if some of these trials would, as part of their, maybe even if it's post-marketing label, would be required to study these therapies in these populations that were excluded from the trials. And I think there's a more openness now to that than there was before, but we need more. So I'm seeing more questions. This is great. So another question from Karen. How do you decide if a patient should get immunotherapy after radical cystectomy, and which agents? Which is a really, really good question. So at Hopkins, we give a lot of neoadjuvant chemotherapy. We try to give it to everyone who has good kidney function. So for us, probably about 2/3 of our patients have gotten chemotherapy prior to surgery. And in patients who have gotten chemotherapy, gone to surgery, who still have high-risk features, which I would define based on the clinical trial, they either have disease that has spread to the lymph nodes, or they have cancer that's made its way through the bladder despite chemotherapy. The T stages are T3 or T4. That is right now what nivolumab, the PD-1 agent, is approved for, and that's based on a randomized trial that showed an improvement in the disease-free survival, meaning recurrence of their cancer, nearly doubled when we gave nivolumab to these patients. And there's discussions about looking at different subsets about the bigger benefit in sort of PD-L1 positive patients, maybe not as much in upper tract, but I think that's sort of parsing things. I tend to offer it in most of my patients, especially if they've gotten chemotherapy. The one question about if a patient went straight to surgery and is cisplatin eligible after surgery, that's an area that we don't have an answer on yet. So that patient could get either. They could get cisplatin-based adjuvant chemotherapy, or they could get adjuvant nivolumab. There are some, I would say, some physicians who are starting to use ctDNA in that adjuvant setting to decide who should or should not get therapy. The only time I've done that, and I've done it in a few patients, was more in patients who had told me that they really didn't want more therapy, and they wanted the ctDNA positive in some ways to reassure them. If it was negative, given what we know so far, they would seem to have a good outlook. It's not absolute. And in those patients, I was willing to sort of get the ctDNA to sort of discuss that with them, but I don't routinely get it in every single patient to guide my standard care. 2 questions from Katie. I'll take the first one. How often can you get CT scans if you have years of suspicious urine cytology with nothing showing in cystoscopy, uroscopy, or retrograde pyelogram? Short answer is I don't know. Insurance usually will dictate it. I mean, I think in that setting, if you've had that much of a thorough workup of the entire urinary tract, if it's the suspicious urine cytology, I'm not sure that the CT scan would probably help us much there, because it would be exceptionally unusual to see a mass that was identified, on CT scan with that extensive of a workup that had never shown anything. Not zero, but incredibly rare. I think a CT scan at some point in there is definitely warranted, but maybe not in a monitoring setting. But as far as the frequency goes, I'll tell you, even in sort of what I think are somewhat standard indications, patients with metastatic disease who maybe they finish therapy and their disease is controlled. I have insurance companies come back sometimes at strange intervals. When I think it's medically indicated they need the CT scan at least every 3 months, sometimes they'll come back and they'll quote an NCCN guideline about every 6 months kind of thing. So I think your physicians and myself, I get into this. Sometimes we have to, do some peer-to-peer reviews if we really feel that they need it. Second question from Katie is, why can't you get an ultrasound to monitor and follow up with CT if something shows? Short answer is you can. It depends on where it's at. So the ultrasound is pretty good, I think, for looking at kidney masses. If you have a renal pelvis mass, it's probably pretty decent. It can be a little bit tricky for ureter. The bladder, you can look at it, but it's going to be, if you don't have metastatic disease and we see a mass on ultrasound of the bladder, if we haven't taken care of it with TURBT or intravesical therapy or otherwise, most of the time urologist is going to want to stage that with some kind of a biopsy or TURBT, because our ultrasound is not sensitive enough yet for us to feel 100% confident that we can tell, for instance, T2 versus T1 on the ultrasound alone. But I do think ultrasound is good, particularly for patients with decreased kidney function, for instance. Let's say if they have an upper tract tumor on the left side and they had a nephroureterectomy and they're 2 years out and they've had no disease, and we're just monitoring the contralateral kidney for risk of upper tract disease. I think in that situation, it can be very helpful. It's about minimizing risk of sort of the contrast and still being able to pick up any masses if they show up. So in that situation, I think it makes a lot of sense. Next question I have here is just from V. Is the CG007 trial complete? I think you mentioned it earlier in your talk. It depends on which trial. So the CG007 trials are all, they're nicknamed the Bond trials just because the 007 that precedes the 0070. And there are several trials. So there's a smaller trial that we were a part of at Johns Hopkins in the last 2 years that was a single arm study looking at the combination of CG0070 intravesical treatment with systemic IV pembrolizumab. That trial, I think, has finished as far as the patients that it was accruing, but we've not seen the results yet. There are a couple of other trials that we got some updates on at a conference that McConkey and I were just at in Barcelona a couple of weeks ago. There is a trial that is an FDA registration study looking at the CG0070 in BCG unresponsive patients with carcinoma in situ. That's looking, I think it enrolled up roughly about 130 patients. That trial is still going on. And then there is also a trial being done in combination with nivolumab instead of pembrolizumab for muscle invasive bladder cancer patients. And that trial is early, so it's still going on. There may be more trials of CG0070 launched in the next year or two. I think what is probably going to dictate that is the fate of their FDA registration study. So if their FDA registration study is completed, reads out, and results in CG0070 ultimately being FDA approved, that will create sort of a revenue stream for the company to then sort of fund, I think, additional studies. But I think that's where things stand as of the moment. That is an interesting intravesical therapy. It's what we call an oncolytic virus, meaning it's sort of a virus that is designed to get into the cancer cells and actually lyse and kill the cancer cells. It's activated only in cells that are deficient in a cancer gene called retinoblastoma that is commonly deleted or inactivated in bladder cancer, non-muscle invasive bladder cancer. So it makes a lot of sense to look at it in non-muscle invasive bladder cancer, but we're just going to need to see, if it results in an approval or not. I would expect that probably to be more, I would say maybe in the next 1 to 2 years that we should get an answer on that. But we're excited about it, and hopeful that that'll provide another option for our patients. So I think I don't see any more right now on the queue. I'm happy to take any other questions if anybody has any parting shots. But what I do want to stress, though, is I do want your feedback on this. Again, provided to Dr. McConkey and others. If sort of a kind of a more open-ended session would be beneficial. It's something we're considering maybe doing on a more regular basis, separate from even the regular programming. So please provide us that feedback. I'll take one more question here from Daryl and then Karen. Getting the last ones in. So from Daryl, is Fairgene product going to ever come to market? Well, that's a good question. I don't know what the over-under on that is in Vegas right now, but what I do know, at least publicly, it does seem that they have submitted what's called their BLA or Biologic License Application to the FDA. What that means is that they've submitted their new sort of data to them and want to be reviewed. Typically, when the FDA receives the BLA, they usually have about 6 to 9 months where they have to issue a decision. And I think we're all in sort of that waiting game. The FDA can choose to issue that decision at any point. So once they have reviewed the data appropriately, are ready to issue it, they can, or they could take it all the way up to the 6-month mark and issue it on the last day. So I think all of the bladder cancer community is eagerly awaiting that decision. I will say that if it is approved, I think that's going to be another great therapy option for our patients. If it's not approved, it's not the end of the world, because I think we've got so many more things that are actually, in the runway of phase 3 trials that are going to be put before the FDA in the next few years, that I'm still optimistic that there will be more options for our patients with non-muscle invasive bladder cancer. As soon as I know, we'll let you know. And then from Karen, what about sustained release drugs given intravesically? This is actually a really good question. And I can tell, Karen, that you're up to speed on a lot of these delivery vehicles. A lot of enthusiasm for them. So there is a drug approved, a formulation of sort of mitomycin by a company called Urogen that is approved for upper tract disease, that uses a unique delivery system that is sort of a foam delivery of the chemotherapy agent that is temperature activated, so that it's administered to the upper tract, and then actually the foam sort of semi-solidifies and keeps the drug there in contact with the urothelium over time. They're looking at a trial in bladder cancer of a similar technology. And then I think a phase 1 trial that just launched publicly in April from Janssen Pharmaceutical Company is looking at an intravesical delivery system that has been nicknamed sort of the pretzel over the years. It was made by a company called Terrace initially. The initial pretzel had a formulation of gemcitabine on it that was administered into the bladder by the urologist just via typical cystoscopy, and allowed to be in the bladder for 2 weeks at a time with continuous delivery of gemcitabine. The trial that Janssen launched in April is looking at the next version of that called TAR-210. And TAR-210 does not have gemcitabine on it. It has replaced that and packaged a formulation of erdafitinib, the FGFR3 inhibitor, onto this pretzel delivery system. So that trial is starting their phase 1 trial. It started in April, so they're very, very early. It's going to take a little while because they're going to need to figure out the timing, the dose, like what do you put on the pretzel, how often, what's the best way to give it. But I'm very excited about that. FGFR, is an incredibly relevant target, particularly for the patients with low and intermediate risk non-muscle invasive bladder cancer. We are leading a trial looking at systemic FGFR inhibition in these patients. We think there's a lot of promise in that, but I think the appeal of maybe being able to deliver intravesical, genomically targeted therapy, perhaps without the systemic side effects, that has a lot of upside to it. So those are just 2 examples of, some of the sustained release technologies that are coming out. There are more, and I think there will be more combinations in the future, which make a lot of sense for non-muscle invasive bladder and for upper tract patients. So more to follow on that, but I think that's an exciting new area.
So Noah, I wanted to thank you for your time today. All of you on the call, tell your friends, this is a great forum to bring your clinical questions specific to your own situation and have them answered by our experts. So spread the word. I, for one, really enjoyed this session, and I learned a lot just by listening to you today. Yeah, yeah. Last chance. Any final words? Well, if not, everyone have a great rest of your week, and I hope that we'll see you at our next opportunity. Take care, everyone, and stay well.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.